Darkness here. I have some bad news. One of the people I was going to talk to for my book, Richie Foronjy, the famous actor, died before I could speak to him. He was going to tell me about Roy's childhood. He said Roy was always a piece of shit. Presumably, Roy was bullying and committing petty crimes after his brother's death. And if you don't remember who Richie Foronjy was, well, he was the brother of Frank Foronjy, who was one of Roy's childhood best friends. They knew each other since they were about four, Frank and Roy did, and grew up next door to each other. And Richie grew up next door to Roy. And the Foronjys continued to be close to Roy until his death, at least Frank was. Like I said, Richie never liked Roy. Unfortunately, Frank Foronjy seems to be mentally compromised, so I'm not going to be able to speak with him. He's just not in a situation where he can be interviewed. So I was going to talk to Richie Foronjy, the Hollywood actor, who at first he was hesitant talking about Roy, but then he agreed to do so in exchange for a not insignificant amount of money that I can't really afford, but I was going to get. And then he died when I went to call him back. Richie was one of the older kids who picked on Roy, but don't blame Richie for anything in terms of how Roy turned out. Bullying was not what made Roy so depraved. I did speak to Richie and Frank's other brother, who's still alive, William. Initially, when I emailed William a year ago, he wouldn't even admit he knew Roy. Then this time, because I'm on good terms with his niece, he gave me a few anecdotes, but he was really too young to remember anything significant about Roy's childhood, like Richie had. And then William said, and nobody basically ever really proved anything about Roy, which is definitely not true. Roy was doomed in the court system. If you are curious why William seems a little rattled here, it's probably not simply because I'm annoying him, though I'm sure I was, but I brought up a loan that Frank took from Roy, which Frank testified was for starting his electrical company. I don't actually think it was for his electrical company, and that was confirmed when William said, I don't know where you're getting information, but he didn't borrow from Roy for his electrical company. But Frank, yeah, he borrowed a tremendous sum from Roy, or Roy gave him a tremendous sum without interest and he was paying him back. So I can only speculate what that's about that Roy was giving Frank so much money for without interest. But in any event, as soon as I brought that up, William seemed to have gotten upset and didn't want to talk further, which is fine. I have some awesome scenes with the Foronjys that are confirmed. But it's not a scene that makes them look bad. Actually, it makes them look tough, and it makes them look honorable. And I'm not going to bother that family any further. I don't want to upset them. Doubly so, since they just lost somebody. Now, this episode's going to be dedicated to Richie Foronjy. Even if you were going to cost me an arm and a leg to talk to you, you were still going to be helpful. Now, let's begin. It was the early to mid 1970s again. Chris was alive. Albert was still a child, and everything was going great for Roy DeMeo. Roy was with his family and some friends, including Frank Foronjy, on board a boat, enjoying the good times. They were in the Atlantic, not far from Long Island. It was daytime. Drinks, laughter. Little Al, who was something like a court jester to the crew, a mini-me Roy, watched, admiring his dad. Any tragedies and hardships he would know were still far in the future. Suddenly, the tranquility of this get-together became a calamity when Roy tumbled overboard. No, no, a little Albert thinks. His daddy's splashing in the water. He might be drowning. Little Al hunkers over the side, and with something along the words of, "Don't worry, Dad, I'll help you," prepares to dive in to help his dad climb back up. Roy's eyes fluttered wide. There's nothing murderous or cold about them now. There's nothing at all but fear. Not fear for himself, but for his son who's too young to play superhero and could easily drown saving him. Roy would have rather sunk below the depths himself than have that happen. No, no, Albert, you stay up there, Roy sputtered. Don't worry, I'll get back up. Roy made it back up, back on board, and they were safe, together again. Now, skip to the 1980s, somewhere far away, another location, and two other men. Kenny McCabe sat in a restaurant and flashed a photo of his wife Sandy and his little son, Kenny Jr. He had nicknamed Duke. FBI agent Anthony Nelson, his unofficial partner, and his best friend sat across from them at the table. Nelson smiled. It was touching to see a father love his family so much. Kenny was a 6'5" giant in a suit, a tough guy, stoic, who faced down and had even been attacked by burly wise guys. But the image of his wife, and Duke, or his other children, well, that made Kenny's stoic, ruddy features soften, and he affectionately grinned. Nelson understood the love Kenny felt for his wife and children. Nelson felt that way about his family, too. It was one of the few things that the two detectives shared with Roy. They would both kill and protect their families at all costs. By 1980, Albert wasn't an innocent child anymore. He was also worried about his dad, whom he now knew killed for a living, and could just as easily himself die someday. He flipped coins, and he pretended that if he just called it right, would somehow tell him whether his dad would come home safe tonight. Albert, who lived a seemingly perfect life on the outside, was feeling pangs of sadness, depression, and terrible anxiety. He had entered an existential nightmare that he was too young to understand. It's far easier to find hell than it is to leave it. Who were you, Roy? Snow fluttered relentlessly to the ground. White blankets flooded the Queen's streets, where the snowplows trundled. The radio warned that the blizzard was going to continue into morning and that the roads were going to turn a lethal mixture of wet and icy. Cold was waiting for him. So were those slick roads. Detective Peter Calabro stood in his precinct, staring into the darkness dampened by street lights. He told the other cops he was waiting to see if he should try to make it home tonight, or if he should wait it out until things cleared up a little. His daughter Melissa, who was just a toddler, and his newly married wife were waiting for him at home. It was indeed dangerous driving home tonight, but the storm wasn't what Peter Calabro was really worried about. There was something far more dangerous than snow and ice that might be waiting for him out there. Peter Calabro was a marked man, and they didn't give a fuck that he was a cop, or who he was connected to. They would have gone to war with the entire DeMeo crew just to get to this guy. The problem had started in 1973. The same year that Peter Calabro became Roy's dirty cop, Peter had married an attractive brunette, Carmela Gentili, after a brief romance. Carmela herself had two brothers, Robert and James, with connections to the New England Mafia. And since Peter Calabro was a wannabe wise guy himself, who had somehow ended up a cop instead, her family ties would have probably appealed to him. In 1976, Peter and Carmela had their first and only child together, a daughter they named Melissa. Although they both loved Melissa, their daughter was really the only good thing that came from that marriage, which quickly dissolved into fights and allegations of abuse. By 1977, Peter and Carmela were estranged and headed for divorce, and they were both fighting like crazy for custody rights. It was on July 19, 1977, that Carmela drove to a Brooklyn beach to meet her husband. She was finally ready to solve this problem that she had. They both were. And it was time to sign the divorce papers. And that should have been the end of it. But horrifically, it wasn't. Carmela was last seen by witnesses walking along the beach with her husband. They were bitterly arguing again, something that they should have been avoiding. And that Peter Calabro was really angry at her. And she wasn't happy with him either and was snapping back. And that's the last anybody ever saw of Carmela again alive. Or if they did, they never admitted to it. Just 5 days later, a Coast Guard spotted Carmela's decomposing body floating a few miles off Monmouth County. Please excuse my spelling, my pronunciation rather. Not familiar with all these words, but Monmouth, Monmouth County. Carmela's family were confident Peter Calabro were responsible. They were very, very quickly to believe 100% that this guy did it. And almost immediately, despite having some mob ties, the Carmela's family went to the cops. They even brought up that Calabro was involved in an auto theft scheme that he had told them about, referencing Roy, even if they didn't really know who Roy was. The cops were suspicious that this Peter did kill his wife. I mean, he was last seen arguing with her. 90% of murders are done by their significant other. He was a major suspect. Peter's problems, they were only going to get worse over the next few years, and cops and courts were only going to be a part of it. Soon the evidence was presented to a grand jury. The motive was obvious: get complete custody over their daughter and get revenge on his wife for making him miserable in his marriage. At that point, Calabro had already moved on over the next few years. He had married a woman named Stephanie, a younger woman. There was enough evidence as the investigation continued to go before a grand jury and take this guy to trial. Unfortunately, back then, juries might have been even more stupid than they are today. And there were a lot of people who believed, a cop wouldn't do that to his wife. They're the good guys. And after days of testimony, the grand jury simply refused to let the case go forward. Calabro was acquitted, and they concluded that Carmela had simply gone swimming and drowned, which didn't make any sense. The detective who had been in charge trying to bring her killer to justice, her killer husband, he began sobbing in court. This was a good detective, and he really, really was upset. He felt like he had failed that whole family of Gentiles. And there were a lot of other detectives who felt terrible too. This idea, this prejudice that, cops all only protect their own, it's a lot more complicated than that. There are cops who would definitely go after other cops if they think they did something. They're good, bad cops, all types of cops. The Gentiles, they weren't upset at the detectives. They understood that they did the best they could. And whatever their differences, mobster, mob connected, law enforcement, there was a mutual respect for these people who tried to bring the man that killed her to justice. So, one of the Gentiles, I think it was her father, but it's never made clear, walked up to the detective at the grand jury after he was acquitted, and he started patting the detective on the back, and he goes, "You guys have done all you can do. Now I have to do it my way, I'm afraid." After that, ever since Carmilla's death, the Gentili brothers, the two brothers, not the father, had been stalking Peter Calabro, making threats outside his house in upstate New York, smacked him a few times, and their threats began to increase after that trial, really increase. Robert and James Gentili, the Gentili brothers, had very dangerous reputations as wise guys and tough guys. These weren't guys that you could just ignore. "We're going to get you," Robert Gentili sneered. "You're dead for what you did to my sister," his younger brother snarled. Calabro had to take these threats seriously, and that meant dodging these guys until they lost interest. Now, fortunately for Peter, Roy was paying him $3,000 a week in bribes, far more than most cops could ever make. Calabro's best friend, who was also one of Roy's childhood friends, John Doherty, was Calabro's partner, also had a wife who mysteriously died a year prior to Calabro's wife dying. She was electrocuted in a bathtub the year before, which would have been about 76. Some people suspected that he had murdered her. Who knows? But in any event, they were able to make a deal. Since Doherty was now living as a bachelor, he agreed to move into Calabro's New York home. So Calabro didn't have to go and sell it and, take the time to sell it. He could get out of there faster. And by 1980, Calabro had a new home in New Jersey. He had paid over $100,000 for. It was large, posh, in Bergen County, which is in New Jersey, the far northern eastern part of the state. And it's an exclusive area consisting mostly of doctors, lawyers, CO types, professionals. Now, it was against department rules for cops to live out of state. They had to live in their own state. I don't want to go into the reasons why. I don't necessarily agree with them, but Doherty was the only cop that knew that Calabro was living in New Jersey anyway. His family put his house in their name, and hey, if they didn't know about it, they can't punish him for it. But all this was for nothing. All this hiding. Somehow the Gentilis found him anyway. Just 2 weeks ago, 2 weeks prior to this snowy night, Stephanie, Peter Calabro's wife, spotted those two thug brothers standing outside their home looking for her husband. And that sent the message pretty quickly that, hey, Peter, you're still in a lot of fucking trouble. And if they're coming this close to your new house, you're in a lot of fucking trouble. So now let's go back. It's around 1 in the morning, March 14, 1980, when Calabro turns to some cops along his shoulders and he says, "Ah, heck, I'm going to try to make it anyway." It wasn't likely the brothers were going to come to him on a night like this. I mean, come on, there were so many nights that they could try to get him. He still had to be safe, still had to be cautious, but he's going to risk it. He's going to risk getting home. So Calabro walked outside into the blizzard, and he climbed into his cheap brown Honda, sputtered it on, and headed trundling to New Jersey through the icy snow. Soon he was off the main road and taking a quiet one. He drove along West Saddle River Road in New Jersey. It's much, much more of a back road, lots of trees on each side, embankments going down filled with white snow, and a lot of darkness. So, snow and darkness were basically everything around him, along with trees. And flurries were just flying down and tumbling against his window almost as fast as the wipers could slap them away. It was a little past 2 a.m. when what happened next occurred. Calabro was probably as eager as ever to get to Stephanie and his little daughter, and he had to be tired after a long day. Then, there behind him, behind his Honda, where the blackness swallowed swirling snow and dim streetlight, something sped towards his tail. Peter Calabro was a predator, but he wasn't keen enough to know when he was being hunted instead. Vehicle followed him, swerved, and sped forward, indifferent to the ice. The darkness and slick roads had, if anything, helped them get closer to their prey. A car hurled past Calabro, and by the time he noticed the danger, it was too late. Murderous eyes peered above a double-barreled shotgun. Somebody cocked their weapon almost as fast as they pulled the trigger. A blast shattered his window and ripped through the side of Calabro's head, just below his eye. Another shot tore through his left shoulder, piercing his body with pellets, causing blood to burst out his head and against the car seat. The clunky Honda skewed off the road, jumped and bounced down that embankment, tearing through the snow and crashing into a tree. The killers, probably pleased, zoomed off into the night. A snowplow trundled along later and spotted the wreck. The men thought they had heard a gunshot, but they didn't see who killed Calabro. Nobody had. Roy had just lost his most useful rogue cop during a period when things were about to get much, much worse. Roy's criminal career had stumbled, and it was now declining as fast as a burning plane right towards its nadir, where he would crash and burn if he didn't act both brilliantly and ruthlessly. But ruthlessly how? There comes a point where paranoia becomes rational, and there almost needs to be a word for such constant terror that's grounded in reality rather than delusion. Roy was drinking heavily now. He was popping pills for his anxiety. He had that kind of terror. This was real. He had a tremendous amount to worry about, from Paul to the cops to snitches. Now, Nino wasn't happy with Roy for leaving him to get caught during the Ippolito murders. Roy needed to come up with a remedy. This was one of the first things he needed to solve that would acquit Nino. His idea for planting a fake expended bullet with Nino as a decoy just hadn't worked out that well, as good a plan as it had been. It turned out that forensics was so advanced now that they could tell a bullet that had been discharged into somebody's neck with one that had been fired into a tub of water. Damn, this only made things more complicated. Now, Roy wanted to whack one major witness. That would make him feel better. Patrick Penny, a lowlife nobody would miss anyway. And Penny had escaped custody for this trial once he'd been quickly caught by Ronnie Cardew, if I'm saying that right, one of the detectives who was always assigned to the Nino case. And the second time that Penny had escaped, Roy had actually managed to receive a call from Penny and talk to him on the phone, where Roy had agreed to give Penny a substantial amount of money if he skipped town. Penny said he'd be happy to take the bribe and leave town. And Roy, well, he'd been overjoyed. And he drove over to Port Authority, except instead of with money, he'd gone with a Dracula and a 38 special. Rodar was one thing, but Roy had no intention of bribing Penny. Those were just lies. Penny was too much of a lowlife who couldn't be trusted, as far as Roy was concerned. He was always getting pinched for things like burglary. The little fucker could get arrested tomorrow for some new crime that he committed, and then betray Roy, cut a deal to testify against both Nino and Roy now, since Roy had bribed him, while forgetting about their bargain. So it was too much of a risk as far as Roy was concerned. Penny had to be whacked. Now, on that day, fortunately for Penny, Roy couldn't find parking at Port Authority, and by the time he and Dracula were able to spot Penny, the cops had surrounded him and were leading him away, forcing him back into hiding. In the meantime, the trial was presided over by Judge Edward Lintel, and the prosecutor was Stephen Samuel. For Samuel, this trial was personal. Just recently, Samuel had prosecuted Pete LaFrocia for the Sherry and Quinn murders which Officer Wendling had taken personally. The case had been fairly strong, but then Detective Blau, that same crooked cop who had helped Roy in his early years recruit crooks like Chris, had come in and testified to LaFrocia's character. And because of Blau's testimony, among whatever details the jury had heard, LaFrocia had been acquitted, which had led to LaFrocia laughing. Now, Wendling and Samuel, they thought that LaFrocia had been laughing and mocking them, but in reality, as I've spoken to him, he said he was just laughing because he was relieved that he was getting off from a murder charge. Samuel and Judge Lintel agreed to sequester the jury for the entire trial. Jury tampering was going to be difficult now. So Nino had already decided he's going to testify himself, and he'd tell the jury that he had only been a mediator that night, that the Ippolitos were whacked, and that the real killer had shot him too. Nino would go on to explain before the jury that when Rodar had pointed a gun at him, Nino had mistakenly believed the off-duty cop was actually that same hitman who had come back to finish the job. Now, Nino's trial would proceed through 1980, while other major events were taking place for the crew. And although Nino would be out of bail for most of it, he'd keep a relatively low profile during this period. He'd initially been denied bail. Judge Lintel and the prosecutor had considered him way too dangerous to be out. But then a higher court successfully allowed Nino's appeal, much to the chagrin of Judge Lintel, and Nino was allowed out during the trial. This trial, well, it was going to definitely be an uphill battle. Anybody with a brain cell knew that Nino was guilty. The evidence was overwhelming. But Nino got lucky. Nino had a friend, a business partner, and a loan shark customer named Sol Hellman, who was close enough to Nino that they even had dinner at the bunker before. And Sol happened to have a young son named Wayne, who was engaged to a jury member named May on Nino's trial. Now, since even sequestered jury members got to see their families, Roy and Nino now had access to a jury member who might be open to being corrupted. So Roy had one of his henchmen, Joey, if I recall from my court files, which are in Brooklyn, not where I'm at currently, send Wayne a message, who then met with May and negotiated for a substantial sum, enough for May to be pressured into doing it. Since what May was doing was a serious felony, she was only a paralegal, not a criminal. How about 25,000? No, no. 50? Okay. It's for Nina. We'll pay 50. Neither Nino nor Pasante's defense attorneys knew about the bribe. This protected the lawyers and made their responses more believable when the verdict surprisingly came in. In the meantime, during the trial, the defense attorneys simply continued to grimly argue for their clients, realizing they were probably going to lose this bad despite their high price tags. I mean, let's face it, the entire OJ defense team wasn't going to win a case like this the honest way. Now, the day that the jury deliberated, everybody was irritated that May was holding out. She kept saying she just didn't believe Penny and thought Nino was probably innocent. When confronted with all the evidence, Mary admitted it was pretty persuasive, but she still wouldn't change her mind. That really made things frustrated. But, as they argued, Mary also knew that if this trial ended in a mistrial, which is what it was looking like, then Nino was going to get convicted a second time on the murder charge anyway. So she compromised. Nino was given a deadly assault charge, Passante reckless endangerment charge, and the jury agreed not to convict Nino on a murder charge, much to the dismay and disgust of both the jury members who thought Nino was guilty, which were pretty much all the others, the judge, and the prosecutor. And the defense attorneys, well, they were flummoxed that they got that. A deadly assault charge made no sense in the scheme of things. But it did still mean Nino was looking at between 5 and 15 years of prison. So he won, but he didn't win that well. I mean, it's better than life. At least, in the meantime for Nino, his lawyers were able to successfully keep him out of jail to await sentencing. With Nino's trial over, the police didn't need Penny anymore, and while McCabe and his colleagues were willing to help Penny leave town, Penny was firm that he was staying right there in Brooklyn because his girlfriend lived there and she didn't want to leave. Meanwhile, Roy and Nino were looking to locate him, although Roy didn't know what Penny looked like yet, since it would have been risky for him or his crew to appear at Nino's trial. But Roy figured, well, Penny was a known criminal, must have a mugshot. But getting one of those wasn't going to be as easy as it would have been a year ago since Calabro was dead, Doherty didn't want to be bothered anymore, and Detective Blau was now avoiding Roy. Roy decided he's going to have to try and persuade another cop into helping him find Penny. Now, among the regulars at the Gemini Lounge was Detective Thomas Sabota. And, well, Detective Sabota wasn't some pernicious wannabe wise guy like Calabro. He unfortunately had a bad gambling habit, just like Calabro had. Sabota owed Roy $1,000. And although he was a 6th precinct detective and knew that Roy was a loan shark, obviously, since he borrowed from him, he didn't know that Roy had a reputation as a homicidal psychopath. He thought Roy was a nice guy, or at least nice as far as loan sharks go. Hey, Thomas, I was wondering if you could help me find somebody. Me and a friend are trying to find this guy, Patrick Penny. He owes us a lot of money, and I've never even seen the guy. Don't worry, I don't want to seriously hurt this Patrick or nothing. I promise. But I gotta get my money back, you know? If you could help me with a mug shot or something, just so I know what the guy looks like, I'll erase your whole debt for you. Sabota was cautious. Roy didn't seem like a killer, but Sabota didn't want anybody seriously hurt either. And obviously he didn't want to ruin his career with the NYPD, which he was proud of. But $1,000? Just for producing a mugshot? Well, that's tempting. especially after he did a little investigating and found out that this Penny was a low-life burglar who had more than a dozen arrests just in the last few years. Okay, Sabota Quest. So long as Roy and his friend weren't going to seriously hurt the guy like he promised, Sabota'd help. He'd get him his mugshot. Soon Roy was photocopying and handing out mugshots of Patrick Penny to his crew. Well, Nino had ordered Roy just to kidnap Penny and bring him in alive so Nino could non-violently try to disincentivize Penny from testifying in the future, probably through a bribe and a warning. Roy had already decided once again to ignore Nino's orders not to kill anybody without his permission. The motherfucker had made him look weak to Nino. By sheer luck, Vito's boy toy, Joey Lee, had gone to school with Penny, so he knew exactly what he looked like and the neighborhood he lived in, the general neighborhood. They were able to confirm the mugshot, and Vito and Joey Lee began scouting that area. Eventually, the duo spotted Penny outside his apartment with a couple of girls. They saw him saunter in the apartment, and for a while they were excited. He didn't come out. So Vito, he got bored, and they went and watched a movie. Vito was pretty lazy. Now, I'm going to go into it scene for scene more in my book, but hilariously, Vito told Roy about spotting Penny, and Roy in turn basically told him to keep his gun on him and do surveillance. Now, Vito, who was the exact opposite of a Kenny McCabe, decided he didn't want to sit bored in a car all day watching for Penny, and hilariously would tell Roy he was doing surveillance and then go off and do something else, which Roy would have probably killed him for. Finally, though, Vito spotted Penny randomly at a gas station and was able to tail him to a bar a few weeks later. Several hours later, Penny left the bar and climbed into his car. He was a little drunk. He started the ignition. Silence. Kept trying, but the car wouldn't start. "Hey, Penny, you want me to help you with that?" Roy said, coming out of the shadows, gripping a revolver. Vito ambled behind him, holding a pair of wire cutters. "Oh, get away from me!" Penny screamed, shoving the door open and trying to kick Roy out of the way. Roy fired numerous times into Penny's head and torso, causing him to drop back dead. Roy glanced around, noticing Vito, wide-eyed, staring at a black man who had just wandered around the corner, oblivious to what he was headed into. "This guy's fucking dead," Vito thought, as he would later state on the stand, noticing Roy gaze coldly at the stranger. The black man immediately looked down and kept walking, passing Roy and Vito. Roy just glowered at him, but didn't shoot. The black man's reaction had convinced him that he wasn't going to snitch. Instead, Roy and Vito turned and fled back to a Malibu they had stolen with Richie earlier, and they jettisoned off. Days later, Sabato learned about Penny's murder from the newspapers. At the Gemini Lounge, Sabato shouted, "You killed that kid! You told me you were just going to hurt him!" Roy threw up his hands. "Hey, Thomas, I had nothing to do with the kid's murder, I swear!" But Sabato didn't believe Roy anymore. The problem was, what was he going to do about it now and not implicate himself in felony murder? This, though, couldn't have made things easier for Roy. A detective now knew intimate details about one of his murders, and if prosecutors ever found out about Sabota's involvement, Sabota was the perfect candidate to cut a deal and testify since he was already a cop and he had been duped by Roy. Furthermore, Nino, he only had one more reason to be incensed. How did it look for his appeals now that a witness against him had suddenly been shot dead? Roy, who was a full-blown alcoholic now, terrified of going down for so many murders and stealing cars, was acting even worse than the maniac he had been before. Roy also had several other reasons to be worried about investigators closing in. Ever since Terry's dream had been raided, Roy had been worried about the crew and extra help flipping and implicating him. Now, just prior to whacking Penny, Roy had murdered one associate who had been the one to flip and tip off the Coast Guard about Terry's dream. On March 7, 1980, Roy had shot Joseph Coppolino several times and then stabbed him, and he'd cut his neck so deep his head had come off. Coppolino's murder had been so brutal it even made the news on TV. Roy's problems were still only getting worse. His associate, Mastrangelo, was caught on a wiretap by an informant, Joseph Bennett, one of the guys who sold equipment for the shrimp boat. He actually sold a little boat that would go out there and bring the other boat in. And Joseph Bennett had flipped to escape charges for abetting them in their marijuana imports. Now Mastrangelo's home was raided and he was thrown in jail. Casso had been killing some of the others, from this fallout of the operation, but Roy had agreed to take this Bennett out if he could get to him. Then, worst of all, Roy's prized auto theft operation was hit with a first serious raid, a raid that he'd never really recover from. Operation Empire Boulevard. Before I continue with Cops and Snitches Part 2, which will conclude this episode, I want to make it clear that I'm not going to be using any of the information from my interviews. I'm also only going to be doing a calculated, very careful amount from the court documents, not the majority of it. And that's because I put so much work into this that I don't want somebody just taking it and using it on YouTube. I don't get any compensation for it. I want that all to be in my book so that people are incentivized to read it. So anybody who has given me information, if you don't hear any of that in future episodes, or if you only hear a little bit of it, that's because I'm saving it. I'd also like to note that there are things in Murder Machine that will not be in my book. They were already covered in Murder Machine. I don't really care that much about Nino's trial details. You won't hear as much about Dominic that you heard in Murder Machine. You'll hear some other things as PTSD, some shocking new details about him that wasn't known even by Walter Mack at that time, including some confessions. And you'll hear, some other things, but there's a lot of things that I'm just not that interested in. The details that I'm about to tell you at Empire Boulevard, they're not going to be in my book. You're mostly going to just hear about a raid because I got to save time, got to cut things back, and introduce you guys to new information. I also think it'd be disrespectful to Capici to repeat a lot of the same details from his book. That's not fair to him. And I have nothing but a tremendous amount of respect for Capici. He's one of my favorite authors. I want you to be able to get different things from Murder Machine and different things from my book. Now, to continue. Since 1979, Roy and Henry had been using a large three-floor warehouse on the busy Empire Boulevard. There, he'd stolen cars, especially Caprices, before some of his crew, including LaFrocia, Dennis Testa, and Freddie, would transport them to another warehouse in Newark, New Jersey, to be shipped to Kuwait. And that operation had gone smoothly until April 22nd. Then, a federal customs inspector named Joseph Tedeschi and another nosy member of the National Auto Theft Bureau, and this was a private company. His name was Anthony Ciardi. Well, they soon began poking around and determined that the Caprices at Pier 292 were stolen. So with a warrant and the FBI and NYPD's help, the cars were secretly confiscated, surveillance was set up, Freddie and Henry, they're caught on camera, and soon the warehouses are raided in what obviously became known as Empire Boulevard Raid. Although none of the main crew were at the raid that day, so they weren't arrested right away, both men were now in big trouble. Furthermore, Freddie was so furious with Henry that he didn't want to work with him anymore because Henry had left all kinds of things in the cars, including cassettes, Torahs, all kinds of miscellaneous items, instead of cleaning them out. And Henry had been sloppy. Against all of Roy's advice about cleaning the cars out, making them look like they're not stolen, Henry had been sloppy. Although Freddie and Roy didn't know just how badly Henry had fucked up yet. In the meantime, Roy was eager to kill again, and this time it was personal for him. Among the hoods in Canarsie who bought coke from his crew and worked at one of the auto shops near Freddie and Richie's was a 30-year-old fellow by the name of Charles Mongor. One night, Charles was at a punk and heavy metal club on 3rd and Bowery named the Gildersleeves. It's the kind of place you'd see Johnny Rotten, who actually did play there that year, from the Sex Pistols. And then, at the same time, you'd see a lot of bands you'd never heard of. Charles was arrogant and brash and always looking for a fight. And he happened that night to come across another arrogant, even more arrogant, brash and loudmouth. This one a 25-year-old punk with a "my daddy's connected to the mob" attitude. And this punk's name was Andrew Mangiano, Mangialano. I'm going to refer to him as Andrew because my pronunciation of Italian-American names or Italian names isn't the best, even though I'm part Italian. Like I said, Andrew was one of these Prince Joffreys, if you are familiar with the Game of Thrones, mafia kids. These guys thought that they could get away with anything if their dad was connected. And that night, music's blaring, there's a lot of power and testosterone in the air, and something, maybe it was a girl or a bump, whatever it was, led to Andrew just violently pulling out a knife and stabbing Charles in the neck, almost killing this guy. He falls over, lands on the ground, is gurgling. Miraculously, the ambulance gets there, and Charles is saved. Andrew, well, he's subdued by bystanders, arrested, and Charles recovers after almost dying. Now Andrew was looking at an attempted murder charge, and yes, Charles was furious. He'd already almost died once on a motorcycle, and he'd miraculously survived that. Now, he miraculously survived being stabbed in the neck, and Charles, well, coked up Charles was feeling a little invincible. And Andrew? Oh, those are serious charges. Andrew was looking at years in the penitentiary. Unfortunately for Charles, Andrew's dad, Sal, burly old school Guido gangster, was a business partner who dealt drugs and stolen automobiles with Roy DeMeo. So when Sal asked Roy to intervene, Roy said, "Sure, no problem. I'll make your problems go away." Later, once Charles was discharged, Vito and Richie suddenly showed up at Charles's door. Richie spoke while Vito stood beside him quietly. He knew Charlie the best, having a shop next to him. "Hey, everybody's sorry to hear about what happened," Richie began. "That guy who stabbed you, Andrew, well, he's the son of a connected guy who's close with Roy DeMeo. Now, Roy, he likes you. He thinks you're an all right guy. But if you testify, Roy's going to be really unhappy about it. He needs you to suffer memory loss. For him. And he'll be generous in return." Charlie looked at Vito and Richie credulously. "Is this guy fucking kidding? Why don't you go tell Roy to go fuck himself?" Charlie said. Vito and Richie looked at each other with wide eyes. They definitely weren't going to tell Roy what Charlie had just said. Vito suggested they come back after they procured the money they were going to bribe Charlie with. And that money, of course, was coming from Roy and Sal. It was a suitcase stuffed with $100 bills, 15,000 in total. Now that's a lot of money for back then. That should have covered his expenses and given him money for other things too. And since Charlie was a coke addict, they also included a little benefit. Thousands of dollars worth of cocaine as a courtesy. Richie knocked, and he handed Charlie a suitcase when he answered. "Here's a gift from Roy in exchange for not testifying against Andrew. It's to show his thanks." After Charlie took the suitcase, he scowled, his stitched-up neck still visible at this point, and he said, "Thanks, but like I said before, fuck Roy and fuck his friend Sal, too. I'm keeping his money, and I'm still going to testify against that punk Andrew. Do you have any fucking clue what that motherfucker put me through?" "Roy's not going to like this," Vito warned calmly. "You think he can do anything to me after what I've been through? I should have died in a motorcycle accident, and even if I hadn't, I still should have died when that punk stabbed me. Something protects me. It's like I'm invincible. I can't be killed. And you guys can't do anything to hurt me." Charlie closed the door, and that pretty much made it clear that Charlie was out of his mind, maybe a little bit too much coke, and that they were going to have to whack him if they wanted to keep Andrew from going to prison. Richie and Vito reported back to Roy and Sal at the Gemini Lounge. "This guy's a real ass. He really doesn't think he can die," Vito explained. "Well, he's gonna die this time," Sal said, fuming that his son was in jail and might go to prison, and this asshole had even stole their money. The crew convened and came up with a plan to lead Charlie to the Gemini Lounge, where they could eliminate him. Since Charlie rarely left his apartment, they decided that they were going to use what Charlie liked the most to bait him. Cheap coke. Richie stopped by Charlie's house. "Hey, would you like a deal? There's some coke over at the clubhouse behind the Gemini Lounge." Charles was suspicious, but the offering was tempting, and he agreed. That night when Charles was to arrive, everybody was ready to make sure this guy did the Houdini. Roy, Eddie Rendeni, the twins, Henry, Freddie, Dracula, of course, Vito and Richie, they were all there. Charles drove up in his slick car, climbed out, walked inside, conversed briefly, bought the cocaine, and then he left. He really was invincible that night. You see, Charles brought a little kid with him who was sitting in the back seat, and he was waiting for Charles to come out. Nobody ever learned who that kid was. Maybe it was Charles, maybe it was his nephew, who knows. But that kid was like a crucifix among vampires, even if he was still outside. Most of the men present, including Roy and the twins, weren't willing to whack a kid afterwards, and they couldn't just leave him out there. Not sure about Dracula. He might have if he was ordered to. He would have probably been the most likely. God damn it. Now they were going to have to try something else. Finally, when the crew became desperate enough, because Charles was going to actually testify that same week, Richie just walked over to Charles' place, they were nearby, and talked him into coming over and helping him work on a stolen Porsche in his own garage. And like I said, they were right next to each other, so that move was especially risky. And Charles, not expecting anything, he agreed. And when he walked inside, there were Roy and Henry, and they opened fire and began shooting Charles apart. Charles charged, and even after being shot quite a few times, he almost made it out. It's like this guy was a Canarsie Rasputin who just refused to go down when he was being killed. But eventually Charles collapsed, and that was that. Roy might have been angry at Charles Mongor at first, but now that he was dead, Roy was a little impressed at how hard it had been to take him down. I know I shot him 8 times in the head, and this kid, he's still running back and forth, DeMeo said. Roy had also slit his throat. Unfortunately, a friend nearby, Daniel Scatero, for whatever reason, ambled over to Richie's garage. Now, although Murder Machine said Scutaro was stalled and killed on a whim, and he said it was just, Roy being bloodthirsty, I've been told by somebody that Richie forgot to lock his garage and Scutaro just wandered in. And that sounds more plausible since their garages were so close together and they all knew each other. Either way, Roy and Henry fired on Scutaro, and unlike Charles, he immediately toppled over dead. Vito and Richie then hauled the bodies into the back of the trunk of a stolen car, and they drove over to a cemetery and left the bodies there. Later, Richie realized that he had left his wallet in the back of the car. He had dropped it, and he panicked and called Vito. I lost my wallet. I think I left it in the trunk, Richie said. Vito, well, he agreed to drive over there, and they managed to retrieve it. Afterwards, Vito said, Roy would have been pissed if he heard about this. Don't tell him. He'll kill me. That July was when Roy had his famous barbecue, which he filmed. And you can see the barbecue footage over at Dominic Montiglio The Life on YouTube. I think he covered all the barbecue footage. That's owned by Ross Broder, a fellow I know very well. And that day, Roy had been very nervous and unhappy. You could see that he had grown a large belly, and that's because Chris was dead, and he was having all these legal problems now, and he had become very insecure and depressed. Roy wasn't the cheerful, hilarious self he used to be. Sometimes he even expressed regret that he'd ever even joined the mob, and that he should have followed Nino's advice and just stayed an associate. And in the coming years, by the way, Roy would sometimes even express feelings that he wished that he'd never been born, or that he wanted to off himself, though it's difficult to know how sincere his suicidal feelings were since he also fantasized about faking his own death. Maybe they were both true. But for now, Roy just seemed morose. And it didn't help that Big Paul tested Roy so much now that he wouldn't even invite him to his house unless Nino was in Florida and he had no choice but to do so he could get a cut of Roy's hard-earned illicit money that Paul didn't really contribute anything for. And as far as Paul Castellano went, he was having his own problems. It had leaked that he was having erectile dysfunction, something that was considered effeminate to the mobsters, and they joked behind his back, never to his face and never to any loyalists to Paul. Mobsters were never good candidates for sensitivity training courses. And an enlightened perspective to them was, his dick can't get hard anymore. Paul might have suspected that some of his guys didn't respect him enough, even if they didn't act overtly about it. But they'd be reminded, you don't fuck with Paul. And if he finds out you're making fun of him, you're fucked. That year, Paul would have become enraged and or the deaths of 2 men who had been in relationships with his daughter. The first was Vito Borelli, who I discussed earlier in the series before I knew when he had actually been whacked. I'd gotten some false information online at that time, and that actually happened this year. And that was the guy who joked about Paul looking like a plucked chicken, and I went over that. Roy made him do the Houdini. The next victim, who'd be meatballed, was the ex-husband of Paul's daughter Constance, and his name was Frank Amato. Now, when they had been married, Frank Amato had cheated on Constance, slapped her around, treated her like garbage, although I'm sure that she wasn't easy to be around either, but I'm not saying that makes it okay. Well, Paul later found out, even though they had been divorced for at least 7 years. I think 74. Well, once Paul found out, he was livid. This guy's gotta go. Roy heard about the offer, and he said that he'd take care of it. Roy met up with Amato, and he offered to make him a deal. Lot of money, probably through stolen cars or drugs or whatever Amato wanted to make money on, since it was a bullshit offer. Then on September 20, 1980, when Roy and Amato planned on meeting, over at the clubhouse, or else. Two of Roy's henchmen, not sure if it was Henry and one of the twins, or Rendini, it could have been, they met with Amato and they agreed to drive him over there. On the way, Amato decided something's not right here, and he started shaking. By the time they arrived, Freddie was outside pinching pennies. He was hunkered over. He glanced up curiously and watched as the trembling Amato was escorted in by those two thugs. Amato was absolutely terrified. He knew that he was a dead man. Inside clubhouse, Roy was there with the rest of his unsavory band of killers. Richie wasn't there. I'm not sure about Vito. Frankie DeChico was there, and later testimony would suggest that Frankie and Roy had actually done some hits, they don't know who, in the past together. Along with Frankie DeChico, Roy, and Roy's crew, there was also an unnamed associate. I never found out who that guy is, or I haven't found out so far. Might have been a snitch later, and that's why they kept it secret. But whoever it was, he was supposed to make his bones that night so that he could get his button. When the associate was about to shoot Amato, they handed him a machine gun. He looked up, held it, and he just couldn't kill somebody. Eventually, after being encouraged and still not being able to do it, Roy left, seized the gun, and fired several rounds at Amato with cold eyes and a smirk. That's how you do it, Roy taunted. Amato's body was chopped up in the traditional way, but instead of taking him to Fountain Avenue that night, Freddie and Richie and Roy, they brought him to a van, and they drove over to Richie's new boat. And there, they sailed out 65 miles the Atlantic and threw him overboard in garbage bags. After that, Roy was feeling good. He thought chopping up those two guys during that fall, that would impress Paul. It had to. But no, Castellano continued to treat Roy coldly. It was just his obligation as far as Paul was concerned. He'd use Roy, but that's it. Near the end of October, another car dealer was murdered inside the clubhouse. Once again, Frankie DeChico had joined them. Nobody who investigated the crime, so far at least, has ever known who that car dealer was. But his body vanished and had either been hauled away by the Vulpes dump truck, Anthony's cousin, and probably driven by Anthony, for that matter, or he'd been driven over to Richie's boat by Richie's van and there tossed over into the ocean to be used as, Roy always joked, shark bait. In the meantime, on the night of Nino's going away party at Tommaso's restaurant, he was going to prison tomorrow and he was looking at years. McCabe and Nelson watched in an FBI car. They saw the mobsters walking in, kissing cheeks, and the usual. Suddenly, Roy stormed outside drunk, and he shouted, Jiminy! Jiminy! You killed me! I'm a dead man because of you! Saliva flying from Roy's lips. McCabe looked at Roy like he was an idiot. Roy, what are you talking about? You testified at the Fadicho hearings. You told them I sold drugs. When Paul finds out, he's gonna have me whacked. Roy, I only told the jury what I believe. Ask any of your friends inside there, and they'll tell you I've always treated them right and fairly and that I don't lie. Roy, you could smell the alcohol on him, leaned over in the car window, and he looked at them with disgust. You're as much killers as we are. And then Roy rolled away and left. McCabe and Nelson could only think, Roy's coming apart. McCabe even thought one step further, it won't be too much longer before we have enough evidence to prosecute that son of a bitch. And when that happens, he's either going to flip, and I think he will, or if he doesn't, he'll end up in the back of a trunk, courtesy of those so-called friends that he has. While all this had been going on, Roy had a new adversary, and this was a guy who had been hearing about Roy for a while, at least his crew, and his name was Walter Mack. Mack was an assistant DA, Second Circuit Federal Court, and Walter was every bit as tenacious, tough, and brilliant as Kenny McCabe was. Now, I know Walter in real life. He's one of my sources for my book, and I can tell you he is erudite and the highest caliber of a lawyer that you can get. He's also very moral, and while some of the wise guy channels have challenged his conclusions and claimed that they don't think he was fair to the DeMeo crew, looking at Jeff Canarsie there, I can say that Walter Mack is extremely moral, extremely thorough, and I have the court papers that show it. His work was nearly impeccable. Walter Mack's father was once CEO of Pepsi, and Walter had grown up a little bit like an aristocrat, but it's not something he's comfortable discussing. He's very modest. He graduated from Harvard, enrolled in Milton Academy to fight overseas. He wanted to fight for his country as a Marine and as an officer. Eventually was promoted to colonel, and Mack became one of the most feared colonels in Vietnam. He had brilliant tactics. The Viet Cong did not like fighting Walter Mack's men, and he had very low casualty rates. By the end of his tour, Walter was studying the LSAT to go to law school with gunfire in the distance. And when he came back from overseas, he enrolled in Columbia Law School. Now, Walter Mack, he's got some amazing qualifications. He is just one of the most productive guys you can get. And he's the type of guy who literally could have been President of the United States had he tried to go that route. He's got better qualifications than most U.S. presidents who have ever been elected. And what I mean by that is he's got qualifications that rival John F. Kennedy or Teddy Roosevelt. Now, since the early 70s, Walter Mack had been working as a federal attorney, and that had been for about 10 years, because, we're in the early 80s now. And he'd been hearing about this DeMeo auto theft crew, although he didn't call them that. They were still focused on Patty. Since the late 70s, that's when it came across his desk. He was bored one day, and he's like, well, this looks interesting, having no clue where it was going to go. By now, he had met with John Murphy, who now had a partner that was helping him, Detective Harry Brady. He's a husky guy. I've spoken with him, too, before. And Mack heard more and more about these stolen cars, and now he's starting to hear that this crew is just filled with psychopaths. He was a little dubious about that, but to be fair, it sounded like nonsense. These guys were being described as serial killers, and their crimes were hard to believe. In any event, he explained that he was going to take these malefactors to prison. Over time, Mack met Kinney, and his interest grew about the auto theft and possible series of murders. I mean, with what all the informants were saying, this crew had the most dangerous and vicious reputation they had ever heard. It was like something out of a horror story. Leatherface's family joins the mafia. But Walter was going to need a lot more evidence than what they had. Fortunately, Walter was a proponent of task force model of handling things and organized crime. And that means creating a combination of cops, FBI agents, and other agencies who answer to the authority of the prosecutor, and creating a kind of team among them so that they would work more tightly together than the FBI and police were usually used to working. They often compete against each other. But this would be like one superhero team, to say. So Walter began pushing for help from Bruce Mao, who was in charge of investigating the Gambinos. He was a very powerful figure at the FBI. Bruce, he didn't have a lot of agents at that time, but he decided he'd send them one of his best, Artie Ruffles. Now, Artie, he looked like a cross between a high school history or English teacher, somebody who would grade your exams really strictly. No, you got that wrong. You got that wrong. And he also looked like a cross between an admiral in the Navy. Very scholarly looking. He kind of looked down, not a conceited way, but more like an academic, intellectual way. Not a particularly imposing man, but he was capable of being tough if he needed to be. He had proven that in the FBI. In fact, Artie Ruffles had been an art teacher before he joined the FBI. He had wanted to join because he needed something that was more exciting, and he wanted to do something good for society. With this growing task force that Walter Mack was establishing, they were going to be truly a threat not just to Roy and Nino, but to Paul Castellano as well. Now, in late 1980, Freddie Denome began talking to some detectives that showed up at his door about some stolen motorcycles that he had left near his house. Freddie was always leaving stolen merchandise near his house, in his house. No matter how much Roy got angry at him, Freddie would do it again and again and again. He was not the smartest or the wisest guy. Now, one of those detectives, he noticed that Freddie was not the smartest guy, and I'll talk more about that detective later. But he came back later on after his partner had left, and he began chatting Freddy up at his house. Freddy thought, maybe this guy's willing to take a bribe. That'd impress Roy. He might be able to get information on McCabe's investigation. Freddy began meeting with that same detective once a week. He even threw tens of thousands of dollars on the bar table at a bar they were at before the guy said, "Put that away," in case somebody saw them. But soon, that detective, he had Freddy convinced that they were pals, although it wouldn't be until well into 81 that the detective was able to get anything from Freddy, because Freddy relaxed his guard enough. Now, during this period, Patty Testa, he also got arrested, and he was sent away to prison for a year because of his young age, though that judge really underestimated how incorrigible Patty was by then. 1980 hadn't been a good year for Roy, and 1981 was only going to get worse. While Roy was taking hit after hit, as well as his crew, the investigators were making even more strides. Kenny and Nelson were convinced Roy by now was a diabolical murderer, and John Murphy, well, he was convinced that the Testa crew certainly were, which of course was actually Roy's crew, and Detective Harry Brady believed it too. Now, well, Nelson wasn't going to be a part of Walter's task force. He remained McCabe's unofficial partner, while Artie Ruffles handled the FBI part and began collecting information. Walter was prepping his task force. He had begun talking to the informants about what they had told Murphy, and Kenny and Nelson would discuss this sinister reputation DeMeo and his minions had. Even other wise guys didn't like going near them. They were a cult of serial killers as much as they were gangsters. Artie Ruffles? He was flummoxed. He hadn't heard of anybody this dangerous since the days of Murder Inc. Now, Walter, he was still cautious about prosecuting them until he knew for sure were as bad as they were said to be. He had to be patient and methodical, but if the horror stories were true, he'd act when he had enough evidence. And once Walter acted, he never gave up, until everybody went down. Meanwhile, elsewhere, Roy was unhappy, and he was worried. Kenny knew about his drug dealing, and now Paul might hear about it too. And what else did Kenny and Nelson know about? Somebody was snitching, somebody close, and maybe even more than one. Soon Murphy and Brady would be watching his house, and by then, Roy wouldn't be able to find solace anywhere. Surveillance would be followed by a subpoena, and more arrests among his crew. Roy was becoming furious, and he was becoming afraid. Somebody was going to die for this, maybe even quite a few. A week might only go by before Roy missed the invincible feeling that taking a life gave him, and Roy was ready to kill every last rat in Brooklyn if he had to, and anybody else who crossed him, until all his enemies were finally gone.